The Grand Canyon is not just one of the most famous natural wonders in the United States. It is a living, breathing organism with a centuries-old history of disappearances, tragedies, and silent indifference to human presence. Tourists who come here often marvel at its scale and beauty, but few realize how quickly and irreversibly its fate can change. One such case, which remains unsolved to this day, is the disappearance of Sandra Jean Mitchell in the summer of 1993. Sandra, a 34-year-old resident of Albuquerque, New Mexico, arrived at the national park with two friends, Janice Walsh and Robert Carter. According to her loved ones, she was an experienced person. This was not her first trip to the Grand Canyon. She was familiar with the climate, knew how to navigate, and never took unnecessary risks. The group planned to spend 2 nights camping on the banks of the Colorado River, descending via the Bright Angel Trail, and then returning the same way. They arrived on June 18th and set up their tents in a designated area near the Pipe Creek Recreation Campground, which was quite popular, but not overcrowded at the time. The weather was stable, warm, and windless. According to Janice, the day passed quietly. They managed to swim in the river, cook dinner, and sit around the campfire until dark. No one noticed anything unusual. No strangers, no strange noises, no smells. Sandra behaved as usual. She laughed, discussed plans for the morning, and according to her friends, went to bed first around 9:30 p.m. The tents were lined up in a row, a few feet apart. On the morning of June 19th, around 6 a.m., Janice went outside and noticed that the zipper on Sandra's tent was open. This seemed strange to her. Sandra usually closed her tent tightly at night. Inside, there was no flashlight, no shoes, and no Sandra. At first, Janice thought her friend had simply gotten up early and gone to the river, but after 20 minutes, her absence became alarming. Robert joined the search, and soon they realized that Sandra was nowhere to be found. According to the instructions, if a hiker does not return within an hour, the rangers must be notified. Janice and Robert contacted the nearest communication station and reported the disappearance at around 8 a.m. The first search party arrived at the camp by 10 a.m. They began searching the area and quickly found the first, and as it turned out, the only evidence of Sandra's movements. 650 feet from the tent, on the trail leading up the bank, lay her flashlight. It was broken. The plastic casing was cracked and the batteries had fallen out. There were no signs of a struggle and no shoes or footprints were found nearby. The strangest thing was that there were no clear footprints leading from the tent to the flashlight. The ground in that spot was dry and hard, and investigators believed that a person could have walked there without leaving any obvious traces, especially if they moved carefully. But it was quite cool that night, and Sandra left the tent without a jacket. All her belongings, including food supplies, medicine, and documents, remained in place. There was also water left in the tent, a canister that was almost full. The search was complicated by the fact that the area was rugged and difficult to navigate, with bushes, boulders, and loose slopes. Rangers, volunteers, and a helicopter combed the perimeter within a half-mile radius of the camp, but to no avail. Thermal imaging cameras, dogs, and even local guides who were familiar with people's behavior under stress were used, but no new clues were found. Sandra's parents were notified immediately and arrived at the park 2 days later. According to them, Sandra had never suffered from mental illness or anxiety attacks, and she was certainly not prone to nighttime excursions. They also noted that she was afraid of snakes and would not have left the tent unless absolutely necessary. Her behavior in the evening before her disappearance did not indicate any cause for alarm. The official report, published 2 weeks after the active search phase ended, stated, "There is no evidence as to where Sandra Jean Mitchell may have gone after leaving the campsite, as well as no signs of a violent incident or contact with strangers." The report emphasizes that the case remains open and will not be closed as an accident, suicide, or intentional departure until additional information is received. 2 months later, in August, one of the park's seasonal workers reported seeing a woman resembling Sandra in one of the areas along the canyon. However, this information was not confirmed upon investigation. Moreover, it turned out that on that day, there were no tourists matching the woman's description registered in the area. This sparked a wave of rumors, but none of these versions were officially confirmed. Despite dozens of hours spent searching the surrounding area, enlisting volunteers and technical resources, the disappearance of Sandra Jean Mitchell remained unexplained. No clothing, no traces, not even basic personal items. Nothing else was found either in the summer or in the months that followed. The park continued to patrol passively, rangers carrying an archive photo of Sandra with them, occasionally checking with tourists, fishermen, and private boaters. Every find, whether it was an abandoned backpack, a piece of fabric, or a blurred footprint on the trail, was checked, but none of them had anything to do with the case. Psychologists familiar with similar incidents suggested that the woman may have suffered a sudden bout of disorientation, perhaps due to a sharp drop in blood sugar or heat stroke. However, this theory did not stand up to scrutiny. Sandra was healthy, active, felt fine on the day she disappeared, and had not complained of feeling unwell. She left the tent lightly dressed without a water bottle, food, or documents, as if she had stepped out for a moment, and she did not return. Among all the trails in the Grand Canyon, South Kaibab stands out not only for its picturesque straightness and panoramic views, but also for the fact that it seems completely transparent to observation. It is a dry, open slope carved in zigzags into the southern wall of the canyon. There is little cover, little vegetation, and almost no places where a person could disappear unnoticed, especially in good weather and with perfect visibility. But it was in this very section, in the early morning hours of September 14, 1989, that a 27-year-old tourist named Kevin Thomas Lloyd disappeared. An engineer from Albuquerque, New Mexico, he came to the Grand Canyon with two friends, Brian Hills and Roy Kramer, whom he had known since college. The trip had been planned for a long time, a 3-day hike with overnight camping on the Colorado River. The group arrived at the park in a rented car and registered their route at the visitor center. On the morning of September 14th, they began their descent of South Kaibab at around 8:10 a.m. The weather was clear and the temperature was comfortable. They moved at a moderate pace, stopping occasionally to take photos. Kevin was carrying a medium-sized backpack, a water bottle, a light jacket, and a bandana around his neck. He was walking last, taking pictures of the canyon with an old camera. Around 9 a.m., they reached the section between Cedar Ridge and Ooh-Ah Point, one of the most open and frequently visited spots on the route. It was here, on a flat section of the trail, that Kevin fell behind by just a few feet to, according to Brian, tie his shoelaces. They walked ahead literally 15 to 20 steps, and when they turned around, Kevin was gone. At first, they didn't think much of it. They figured he had just lingered or turned aside to take a picture or relieve himself. 10 minutes later, they returned along the trail calling out to him, but there was no response. The trail was completely empty. For the first 30 minutes, they searched on their own. They went down a little further along the route, then climbed back up to the last point where he had fallen behind. There were no traces, no backpack, no movement, no sound of footsteps. When almost an hour had passed, Brian decided to go back up and report the possible disappearance to the ranger station at South Rim Village. By 11:30, the first park security officers arrived at the scene. Over the next few hours, an emergency search operation was launched. Duty crews and some rangers were called in, and 2 trackers with dogs were summoned from Tucson. By 3 p.m., a helicopter began flying over the area, but there was no indication of Kevin's possible route. Neither from the air nor from the ground was it possible to find any clothing or traces of him leaving the trail. The soil in this area is dusty with sparse pebbles. Any deviation from the trail should have left at least some footprints, but there were none. The dogs lost the trail just a few feet from where Kevin was last seen. There were no caves or crevices nearby where a person could have fallen, and the visual range was almost perfect for dozens of feet in front and behind. The search continued throughout the first night. The group remained at camp while several patrols searched the surrounding area, including the foothills and nearby slopes. But even at night, As the temperature dropped, there was no cry, no sound of footsteps, no accidental noise that could indicate the location of a person in distress. The next day, more than 40 people, including volunteers, joined the search. They expanded the radius, checked steep slopes, examined hollows under ledges, and called in climbers to check hard-to-reach niches. There were no signs of life. Kevin's parents arrived at the park on the third day, when his disappearance had already made headlines in the local press. They insisted on visiting the trail where their son had disappeared. Kevin's mother, Judith, later told reporters, "I don't understand how a person can disappear in a place where everything is visible as clear as day." And that was the main paradox of this story. Kevin Lloyd disappeared in a completely open space with perfect visibility on a trail where dozens of other tourists passed by during the day. None of them noticed anything unusual. The official search lasted 9 days. Every square foot of the trail between Cedar Ridge and Skeleton Point was searched, to no avail. The only official conclusion was, the site of the disappearance shows no signs of foul play, a fall, or voluntary departure. But no one could explain what had happened. 2 weeks later, the case was classified as an unresolved disappearance. Posters with Kevin's face hung in the Grand Canyon Visitor Center for almost 6 months. Then, in May 1991, a group of tourists from the University of Arizona, walking along a nearby side trail, noticed something resembling a skull in the bushes. It was discolored, partially covered with sand and moss, and lying under the roots of a tree about 5 miles from the disappearance site. At first, they thought it was the remains of a coyote or other animal, but when one of them noticed that the skull was clearly human, they called the rangers. A week later, forensic examination confirmed that, based on DNA and dental records, the remains were those of Kevin Lloyd. No other bones were found nearby, no clothes, no shoes, no backpack, just a single skull lying cleanly at the foot of a tree, far from the main trail. At the time the skull was found, almost 2 years had passed since Kevin's disappearance. All that could be established with certainty was that the skull did indeed belong to him. All other questions remained unanswered. How did he end up 5 miles from where he was last seen? Why were no other remains found? Why was there no clothing, no shoes, no signs that the body had been lying in the open for 2 years? The place where the skull was found was itself suspicious. It was located in a remote, inaccessible ravine off the beaten track. To get there, one had to pass through dense yucca thickets and sharp bushes, then cross a dry riverbed that had collapsed after rains. For an unprepared person, especially without a map or equipment, it was almost impossible to get there. Most importantly, in the first weeks after the disappearance, the area had been searched by rangers, who found nothing. The investigation then turned to forensic experts to determine whether the skull could have been moved by predators. But here, too, everything was inconclusive. There were no bite marks or damage characteristic of dragging. The skull lay too neatly, right on the surface, partially covered with autumn leaves and sand. It looked more like someone had deliberately placed it there than a random coincidence. Kevin's parents, upon learning of the discovery, returned to the canyon. His father, Harold Lloyd, told a local television station, "We have received no answers, no comfort. We have only received a part. Everything else is gone with him." The investigation attempted to reconstruct the chronology of events, compare possible trajectories, and requested data on seismic activity, possible underground cavities, and animal movements. But none of the theories were confirmed. The area where Kevin disappeared was stable, with no landslides or ground movements recorded in the vicinity, and even records of large predators such as cougars and coyotes yielded nothing. The uncertainty of the situation soon gave rise to a wave of rumors. Some locals recalled other cases of disappearances in the canyon, cases where, despite massive searches, people could not be found. One ranger, speaking privately, said in an article in the Arizona Daily Sun, "If I didn't know that trail like the back of my hand, I'd think he fell through the ground." Another park employee, who wished to remain anonymous, said that in the Cedar Ridge area, compasses sometimes behave strangely, and that even experienced guides have gotten lost several times. A psychological evaluation conducted as part of the investigation ruled out the possibility of intentional departure or suicide. Neither friends, relatives, nor colleagues indicated any signs of depression or instability. Kevin was an avid hiker, physically fit, had good coordination, and knew how to behave on a hike. After all, he was not a loner. He disappeared right in the middle of his friends on an open trail. The official report, released in January 1992, concluded with the following statement: cause of death, undetermined; place of death, undetermined; mechanism of disappearance, undetermined. Inside the park, his case was kept in a closed archive until 2001. Since then, it has been classified as historically closed, although Kevin Lloyd's case remains open legally. His disappearance has been the subject of discussion among independent researchers of anomalous cases. His name is mentioned in several compilations about people who have disappeared in national parks. Some have compared his case to others where all traces of a person simply disappeared. Cases in Shenandoah Park, in the Lassen area, and on the Pacific Crest Trail. In each of these cases, the same pattern was absent. A person left the group with minimal distance and disappeared without a trace. No falls, no screams, no clues. What happened to Kevin Lloyd on that clear September morning in 1989 remains a mystery to this day. His disappearance remains one of the most bizarre and inexplicable in the history of the South Rim of the Grand Canyon. In Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona, the Tonto Plateau is known for its challenging trails, hot climate, and desolate landscapes. It is not the most popular trail among casual hikers, but it is well known among experienced hikers who prefer solitude and demand a real challenge from a trail. One such experienced hiker, Edward Robert Lawrence, a resident of Albuquerque, New Mexico, set out there in August 1990. He knew the area, was well prepared, and had hiked solo routes through the canyon many times before. Edward was 52 years old. He was a retired electrical engineer, a former military man, a widower, and had no children. Tourism and cartography were his hobbies. He had been to Arizona many times, kept detailed route notes, used paper maps and a compass, and avoided GPS, which was not unusual at the time. His diaries contained dozens of sketches of the area, and his notebooks contained the exact coordinates of his previous campsites. On August 17th, he arrived at the southern tip of the canyon and registered at the visitor center, indicating the estimated duration of his trip: 4 days along the southeastern section of the Tonto Plateau, with overnight stays at key water sources. On August 21st, the day he was supposed to return to his starting point, Edward did not show up. According to instructions, rangers were to wait at least 24 hours before taking any action. But the next morning they were approached by tourists who were expecting to meet him at the junction of the trails. Edward had promised to show them an old well he mentioned in his diary. He did not show up. He also failed to contact the local forestry office where he was supposed to confirm his return. The search operation began on August 23rd. The first thing they found was his parked car at the trailhead, in a parking lot with no signs of forced entry. Inside were only empty bottles, documents, and an old backpack. The next discovery came fairly quickly. On the first day of the aerial search, a helicopter spotted a strange straight line on the ground, resembling footprints running along the southern ridge of the plateau. A group of 3 people walked to the spot and confirmed that the prints belonged to an adult wearing hiking boots. The shoe size matched Edward's. The tracks stretched for about 2,500 feet, then ended abruptly on a flat, rocky area, with no signs of a fall, bloodstains, or drag marks. There were no scratches on the rocks, no signs of a struggle or outside interference. The surrounding area was clean. This place became key. The trail there intersects with an ancient dry gully, climbs up to a flat terrace, and heads off toward a sparsely populated canyon. All escape routes were clearly visible from the air, and no one, not investigators, rangers, or volunteers, could understand how a person could have disappeared literally 5 feet from a solid rock platform. There was no vegetation to hide in. There were no cliffs to fall off either. Below was only a dry canyon with no water. The search lasted 6 days. Helicopters surveyed more than 9 miles in radius. Dog handlers combed the ground, and geologists were even called in to assess the possibility of hidden sinkholes. But no backpack, no clothing, not even traces of a temporary camp were found. Edward Lawrence's name was entered into the federal missing persons database, and the case was closed as an unexplained disappearance. 4 years passed. In May 1994, a group of geology students from Northern Arizona University were conducting research on geothermal sites in remote areas of the canyon when one of them stumbled upon an abandoned camp. The site was about 10 miles from where Lawrence's tracks had been found. The camp was located in a remote hollow with no water, accessible only by compass or map. The tent was destroyed. The fabric rotted away. Inside lay half-decayed books, a notebook, a battered canteen, and the remains of plastic packaging from freeze-dried food. Everything pointed to the camp belonging to Edward Lawrence. An examination confirmed that the finds had been lying in the sun and rain for at least 3 years. However, no skeletal remains or other signs of the man's presence were found. The items were laid out neatly, as if the man had planned to spend the night and return soon. No wolf tracks or other animal tracks were found nearby. The FBI and the National Park Service reopened the case. The official version of death by dehydration was considered, but many factors spoke against it. The location of the camp was extremely irrational, without access to water, in a hot area where an experienced tourist would not go. Edward himself did not suffer from mental illness, did not take medication, and had military and hiking experience. Nevertheless, no one could explain how he ended up in such a place when his tracks ended dozens of miles from where the camp was found. Lawrence's case still appears on a number of lists of unexplained disappearances within U.S. national parks. His story is not just the tragedy of a single tourist. It is a reminder that even the most familiar trails can turn into a trap. There was no storm on the Tonto Plateau, no criminals, no predators. Only a man, the desert, and the emptiness that closed in on him at some point. That's all for now, friends. If you're interested in what else national parks have to offer, like, subscribe, and remember, sometimes all it takes is a second to look back and never return.